So hello everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with two very special guests and also in a very special place. We're in Don Eugenio's Garza's home, exactly in his living room, where I'm sure that he got lots of inspiration. This was called the music hall, and I'm sure that many of his ideas came about in this room with his family, with his friends. And now we're here with two very important friends for Monterrey, for Mexico, and hopefully for the world community. First of all, Federico Garza Santos, which is the chairman of the board of the Centro, Eugenio, Sada. Thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to have you here. And Raj, which is also the chairman of the Conscious Enterprise Center at Tec de Monterrey, which was recently launched as the idea that the end is behind both of these institutions, which is really trying to rethink capitalism and really elevate the richness out of what capitalism has been to society worldwide. We're right now maybe in a tipping point where there are different movements that promote this rethinking of capitalism with many names: social capitalism, conscious capitalism, stakeholder capitalism. And in some way, we're here to specifically talk about those movements and how they are locally expressed. And I think that Centro Eugenio Sada, with its social capitalism initiative, is a very good example of it. And in some way, we also want to identify really if this is only for a certain type of businesses, certain type of size of business, or it's really something for any type of business and community. So getting into our conversation, I mean, all of these concepts, and this question is for you, Raj, but certainly, I mean, this is a casual conversation, so you can fit in as well, Federico. What do you think these concepts are resonating within the business leaders in this moment in time?
Well, these concepts have always been important, and they've been around for quite a long time, as we know. There are companies such as FEMSA and such as the business community here in Monterrey that embodied a lot of these things close to 100 years ago. We have companies in India that are 140 years old, like the Tatas, that always operated with these high ideals and principles. But what was a good thing to do is becoming a necessary thing to do, I think, in the world today. The consequences of business as usual are no longer affordable to society. That capitalism as a system is one of the most extraordinary ideas we've ever had. In the last 200 years, it has done so much to lift up humanity. Worldwide, per capita incomes have risen something like 1,800%, and life expectancy has more than doubled, and literacy has gone from 13% to 87% in that 200-year time period. So it has done a lot, but we're also starting to now recognize some of the side effects or ancillary impacts that this has had. And until recently, those seem to be okay, that we can afford to absorb those side effects because of all the other positive side. But now we're recognizing that the so-called side effects may in fact overwhelm the main effects, right? So most particularly when it comes to the environment and the ecological destruction generally that has happened in the last 100 years. I mean, this planet has been around for 4.5 billion years, but in just 100 years, we've managed to kill 90% of the mammals and destroy 80% of the natural forests, and so on it goes. We're living through the 5th max extinction in the history of this planet, the first primarily caused by human activity. So we've really come to a point where the consequences of business as usual could in fact devastate not only the ecosystems of the planet, but our very ability to survive in the next 100, 200, 300 years. So we really have a sense of urgency now to say that we need to rethink every aspect of business. Why do we do it? How do we do it? What are the impacts? What is our definition of success what is our time frame. So we have to rethink all the fundamental questions: why, what, who, and how of business. And we have to figure out how to do business in a way that does not have these so-called side effects. In fact, the reality is there's nothing in this world called a side effect. We do something and there are effects. And now we have to be responsible and accountable for all of those effects and have a commitment to having a positive impact in every one of those areas. We used to think that was impossible, that there's always trade-offs, but we're recognizing actually that that is not true. It is possible to do business with a positive impact in at least 8 dimensions: financial, intellectual capital, social capital, emotional well-being, spiritual well-being, ecological well-being, physical well-being, and a positive impact on the culture. And so this can be done and it must be done, because as I said, we can't afford to go down the old path because we will self-destruct.
So Raj and Federico as well, what do you think brought us to this situation? Certainly unconsciousness, but which would be some elements or characteristics that brought us to this situation that you just described?
Well, I would say it is a lower consciousness approach that has really put self-interest narrowly defined as financial wealth above all else. And I think this accelerated in the 70s. Before that, many companies were more stakeholder oriented. They did tend to care about the communities that they operated in. The income differentials between the CEO and the workers were not that great. But around 1970, we entered the era of shareholder-centric capitalism, profit maximization, the Milton Friedman essay, and then a lot of academic work that was done in that decade around agency theory, etc., which basically cemented the idea in people's mind that the only objective of business is to maximize shareholder value. And some people even thought that's the law, that you can get sued if you don't do that. So it really started to make all trade-offs in favor of shareholders. Right? Anytime there was a trade-off between customers, employees, environment, communities, etc., we started to do that. And I mean, the irony is that even as we became more obsessed with profits and shareholder value, the actual performance actually went down. Our ability to generate profits, I think you mentioned earlier that if you might do it in 1 year or for the next 6 quarters, but in the long run, you hurt your ability to be a viable value-creating business by doing those short-term things in order to increase the share price or increase profits. So I think that's really when it started. It's about a 50-year-old phenomenon, and it has spread around the world. This is, I would say, the American-style capitalism, very financially focused, very short-term oriented, where it became the dominant model worldwide. Partly because it made a lot of executives very wealthy, because a big part of it was paying people in stock, right? And so their compensation started to skyrocket, and the ratio of pay, which used to be about 50 to 1 between highest pay and average pay, when it went to about 500, 600 to 1. Now it's about 400, right? So you started to see those kinds of things, and you started to see a lot of people left behind. So certainly in the last 40 years, worker pay has been flat in the US. Executive pay has gone up 1,000%. Right? And somewhat similar trends exist in other places. So you're starting to now see, it's like the compound interest, all of those things are now showing up in terms of societal backlash, in terms of crashing reputation of business, especially big business, and in the rise of populist movements, populist leaders, and the re-emergence of socialism as a popular idea, especially among young people. Now we know that that system really doesn't work, but it has a kind of an appeal at a human level to a lot of people to say, yeah, why can't everybody have the basics, right? So it is a bit of a crisis moment, I think, for capitalism.
What Raj just explained, I mean, I totally agree with him. And I'm not a technical guy, so I would probably explain it on a way much simpler way. The way I see it, it's capitalism is a system that created great things for humanity, and it created all this wealth, and it created all these benefits. But like any model, needs to be adjusted. So it started working out well, and then, like most models, then they start having these areas where you need to adjust. And what happened was that who will be doing that adjustment? So in many ways, power got concentrated. or either by influencing the government, or for whatever reason there was there, but nobody really took the time to say where does the capitalism needs to be adjusted, and any model needs to be adjusted always. You cannot just write a model and expect that that model will work well forever. So I think we've been slow in recognizing that our model is out of fine-tune. We need to do fine-tune. And, but that doesn't mean that capitalism it's the wrong model. We just need to adjust it. And if we don't do that, I personally believe that if we don't do that on time, we are going to have very difficult things we're going to have to be dealing with. And there's a lot of red flags out there, and we've seen all this populism from right or left, and it is also putting democracy in jeopardy. I mean, I think it's not only capitalism; it's democracy itself that is in danger right now.
Yeah, I like the way you framed it. You know, I think if you think about the human journey on this planet, right, it's one of rising consciousness, right? What was acceptable 150 years ago, there was slavery in the US and many other countries, and today we cannot imagine that. 100 years ago, women did not have the right to vote. 75 years ago, we still had colonialism. India was a British colony. 50 years ago, there was segregation in the United States between blacks and whites. 30 years ago, we had apartheid. Right? 20 years ago, there were no rights for gay people. So we are constantly evolving and waking up in every aspect of our life. And yet, when it comes to business and capitalism, as you said, we've kind of been stuck, right, in this time warp where we've taken some ideas and haven't really adequately evolved them to reflect our higher consciousness and our higher aspirations, you know, and the realities of the world that we live in today. And the other point you made, which I think very critical, is, you know, after 1989 and the coming down of the Berlin Wall, which was a symbol of the defining debate of the 20th century between communism, socialism, government ownership and control of every aspect of our life, and capitalism, democracy, and freedom. And we thought that that debate that would go on forever and maybe end with a nuclear war, right? Nobody thought that that debate would end peacefully. And suddenly, you know, without a gunshot being fired, that was over. And in a way, democracy and capitalism at that moment were seen as joined, right, as together, that these two things go together. And I think in the last 30 years, what has happened is that democracy and capitalism in many places have diverged. And what really needs to happen is that the higher value between those two is democracy. And capitalism needs to serve democracy. And in many places it's not. Or it's the other way around, where you have the government, in a way, serving capitalism. And that's crony capitalism, as we talk about, right? That's not real capitalism. We call it crapitalism, right? And that's what, when people hate or criticize capitalism, they're really criticizing crony capitalism, the unfair, you know, stacking of the deck and competing without actually, you know, being in an open, free market.
Francisco, I'd like to, I'm not supposed to be doing questions here, but I'd like to do one.
Of course.
Because I think it's one of the most interesting things about what's going on with this movement. And as you were describing it, I believe that the movement is gaining power, which I think this is great. But there's different ways of thinking of how this movement will be moving on forward. And obviously there's this group that expects the government to be the one that you know, gives these guidelines of what we should be doing. I personally believe that that is very hard to happen, because politicians are running
short
for election every time, and that automatically makes them be of a more short-term belief. And stakeholders capitalism, or conscious capitalism, or whatever term we use, it's basically a long-term view. So I think that, as we were saying earlier, that this model is not working and somebody needs to take charge and do something about it. I believe that the ones that have to be engaging in this responsibility is the business people. I think business people have to be pioneers in making this happen. Of course, government needs to do their part, but I'd like to understand What do you think about that?
Yeah, I do agree with you that the business sector in most countries now is more powerful, more impactful, more resourceful than most governments. Most governments are bankrupt and they don't really have the capacities to really manage things very well. So I think business sector has to take a lead but not be the only player. The way that I say it is that the business sector, we need to wake up, grow up, and show up. In other words, we have to look at the bigger picture. We are not in an island. We are part of society. We are part of this planet. And therefore, we have to act accordingly and show up with regard to the biggest challenges that the world faces. We can't look to governments or other entities to solve them. So we have to mobilize. And I think that's happening. If you look at what Paul Polman is doing now, the former CEO of Unilever, he's trying to mobilize entire industries to get a critical mass of CEOs to say, let's change all the major practices in this industry. At the same time, recognizing that there is a need for well thought out government regulation of certain kinds, right? So I think it's really tri-sector partnerships, but business taking the lead with a viewpoint not to say what can we do so that business becomes more profitable, but rather to say how do we build an ideal society, right? And this is the vision for how we do that, and this is what business is going to do, but here are some types of regulations that would help in that transition, right? So that we're not held hostage by the lowest common denominator type of practice out there, so that we're able to compete on a higher playing field, right? So I think it's really a combination, but I agree with you that business has to take the onus and take the lead. And I think this community is a wonderful example of that for the world to look at. The business community came together and had a vision for how to develop this region. And through their collective action and collective commitments, they have shown the consequences of that.
Going into that, and if you could give us, Federico, a little bit of historical context. You talked about adapting the model of capitalism. Centro, Eugenio, Sada reminds us of the foundation of Monterrey and the values and how entrepreneurs adapted also the existing models of doing business and to the needs that they were finding in that moment. Could you describe a little bit that type of adaptation in their business models and then fast forward it to what we should need to adapt right now in at least in the local community that we have here in the northern part of Mexico?
Well, I think Monterrey is a very particular story because Monterrey was a really small place in Mexico back in the late 1800s, and it really was a economic and social miracle what happened here, and there was obviously geographical reasons and several outside reasons why Monterrey became this great example, but primarily it was what their businessmen realized that they had to do in order to flourish. They were having all these difficulties to attract knowledge and good people, and so they were looking into ways of how they could do that. So they started sort of best practices back then, where they would somehow either first hire outside people and then try to train them in Monterrey. And so the education part became sort of a mantra that we needed to work into education in order to progress for industrial purposes, and at the same time they realized that they needed to have better wages so they could train and keep people, and then they realized that they need to help their workers to have a nice house where they could be more productive. So it was something basically that this theory that Raj describes so well in his book, it was actually the philosophy that was being done here in early 1900s, and that example, I think it's so powerful because we saw what that did to Monterrey. If you compare other cities in Mexico in those years, and you see what happened into Monterrey, it's very, very clear the success of this model, of this economic model, because I basically think that this is an economic model. It's not just a way of doing business. This is an integral business model of how we should be working, and basically what did happen is that Monterrey became the industrial leader in Mexico and the reference for all of Mexico and for government itself, because local society started with all this social benefits for their workers, which became law many years after in Mexico. So it was definitely a pioneer. But then it created some sort of looking at back into it. It's funny how once it became law, then you only do up to whatever it's needed by law, and so it's kind of a weird thing how it happens, and then I don't know if I should go that deep into that, but then in the late 80s, or when Mexico started to open up into international commerce, we started moving to these best practices, these best international practices. But the way I see it, they weren't best practices; they were worst practices that were happening pretty much because of this movement towards this Milton Friedman's ideas, which I think they were genuine, but it was just a bad theory. And we sort of lost track a little bit there. I don't think we completely lost it, because many of the companies that practice this model are still there, and some of the most successful companies in Mexico. And that's something you describe in your book, how companies that do this tend to be the most longevity. They have the longest lasting periods, and then they tend to be more profitable. But when you think of profits, you need to understand that the way you get there, it's by a long-term approach. You need to have the patience to build whatever you're building, to work with your whole environment to make sure that you can actually get wherever you want to go. But that is, to me, one of the most easy way to describe our flaws in our system is this short-term view, and that is what creates many of these problems.
Talking about, Raj mentions that the word courageous patience, no? Really, because sometimes it has to do, and I think that what describes the founding and entrepreneurs of Monterrey had certainly a courageous element within them. Now, talking about adaptation of the actual model, certainly long-term view, would there be another element that you would include to the actual capitalist model that resides in the majority of the businesses in Monterrey, in northern Mexico? Which other elements would you
Well, we started
adapt?
working on this model several years ago, and the culture is still there. This model, this idea is still here, impregnated in most businessmen, but it's kind of a little bit rusty. So when we first started, trying to promote this movement again, we did have some difficulty into understanding that we need to do something, we need to act. But fortunately, I would say that it's moving quite along right now. I see people understanding the need to move into a more inclusive form of understanding economics. I think all this debate about inequality. It's pretty much sinking in whether there's all these debates of exactly what's inequality and what's not inequality, and I don't want to get into that, but the truth is that there's this huge gap of inequality, and I think it's unsustainable. It's just simple social psychology. I mean, you cannot keep on growing inequality and expect nothing to happen. And I think that's something that we need to understand as a society. You cannot just keep on expanding inequality and expect that things are going to stay the same way. And that's why I say either we act right now or somebody's going to act, and most probably it's not going to be in a peaceful way. Yeah. So I don't know if I answer your question.
No, and I think that I mean, talking about those aspects, no, and even social psychology elements and things that maybe go beyond what a normal businessman would in business, any company would identify as a role. Raj, what would you think about the involvement of companies, businesses in public issues, in public matters? What would be the role of companies into that?
Well, if we consider society to be a stakeholder, which I think we should, to me society is the first stakeholder. If our business is not having a positive impact in the world, then we have to rethink our business. So if society is the first stakeholder, in a way we are citizens of our countries, and our companies in a way need to be citizens as well and have that mindset, which means a sense of responsibility for the collective well-being and flourishing of that society. And so when issues get surfaced in society, such as in the United States a couple of years ago, we had the whole diversity conversation, George Floyd, etc., or whether it has to do with now the environmental issues, whether it has to do with income inequality, whether it has to do with the role of women. All of those things are societal issues that come up, and we are a member of society, and therefore we should participate in those conversations and in finding solutions. I think businesses are great at innovating and at finding win-win solutions, and I think that's where we need to continue playing that role. So I am not a believer. There are some companies that are so afraid of offending anybody that they will not take a position on any issue. And there are other companies that say, this is our purpose, these are our values, and anything that happens in society that is connected to these values, we will be outspoken about, right? If I'm Patagonia and I care about the environment, I'm going to talk about every time there's something that to do with the environment, certainly, right? And likewise, other companies do that. And then there are some core values that are just human values. And so I do believe that companies have a responsibility to do that, and they have tremendous power to affect change.
Okay.
So if you look at the end of apartheid in South Africa, it was the actions of people like Nelson Mandela and many others, but it was also the actions of certain high-minded corporations that lent the force of their presence and their economic impact to bring about desired social change. Same thing in the American Civil Rights Movement. There have always been companies that are at the forefront of trying to bring about progress in society. So I'm a strong believer that that should be the case.
Yeah, we talked during our tour to Don Eugenio's house about the tipping point in his life when he was starting to get involved in media outlets and other type of organizations beyond his businesses. In your journey with the initiative, Federico, what has been the reaction of business organizations around involving in public matters in a more protagonistic way, not necessarily through others? What has been your experience talking to those organizations, and what do they see about that role?
Well, I think, Mexico, it's a very particular situation. It's not the same as many other countries or the U.S. in terms of what can be said or should be said or or what kind of role does a private enterprise have. We believe in Centro, Eugenio, that businessmen have great power, and with great power comes great responsibility, and with great responsibility you need to speak out if things are not going right. And I think that's something that traditionally has not happened in Mexico, and probably what cost Don Eugenio's life. But there's no other way. I mean, I believe that we need to participate in politics. That doesn't mean that we're politicians or we're going to run for office, but we need to stand out in terms of what we see that needs to be done. And as we started moving into this model, because as I was saying, I believe this is an economic model. There was some skepticism at the beginning, but in general, there's been great acceptance, and I'm pleased to say that not only with the big companies, which were probably a little bit skeptical about being more spoken about this movement, because one of the things we believe in is we need to be more outspoken about all these best practices that we do have, and in Monterrey, one of the ideas that we were probably misinterpreted was to be very humble, and I think it's great that we have that idea. But one thing is to be humble as a person, and one thing is not to communicate your good practices, because that only brings other people to have good practices. It creates a positive circle where if I know that you're doing something that works, well, I'm going to want to be doing that, and the other guy is going to want to be doing the same thing. So that's something that slowly we're moving, and we've generally have had this acceptance that they're open to communicate their good practices. So that's a good start, and in general, we work with donations, and we've been having many small donations, and I think that's even way much better. You don't want to have any dependence on anybody. I think that's something we've always been very careful about, and we've been having a lot of small donations, and we're very happy because first of all, it's not the big guys, it's the middle guys and the small guys, and now that we're doing this courses where we're having small entrepreneurs going into understanding this model, they get really excited, and they might not be able to help with all that much money, but they're willing to help in whatever ways they can. So I think we have a good future in terms of how the public, and particularly the business public, is getting this movement.
You talked about those courses that involve not only the business community but also civic community, NGOs, etc. Raj, in your experience around the world, talking with business leaders, which would be the gateway for them to understand their role and the way to cooperate with government and civic society? What would be like the process that you would identify for them to be enabled in order to participate beyond what their business scope is?
Well, I think it's an extension of what I just talked about. When you start to view yourself as a citizen, as a business being a citizen, and society as your primary stakeholder, then you have to get involved. And you have to also, just from a viewpoint of enlightened self-interest, recognize that you cannot, as a business, flourish in an island of suffering. And if there is suffering around you, then we have to figure out how we become part of the solution of that. And I think taking the lead, as we talked about earlier, in organizing the business community around that, and then inviting NGOs, universities, civil society generally, and the government to participate in finding creative solutions. I've seen that in a number of places. I wrote about that in the Healing Organization, about a company in Detroit called DTE, which is the largest electric utility in that region. And as an electric utility, you're kind of a foundational business, right? Because you're providing the resource, infrastructurally, electricity for everybody else to be able to survive. And when they saw that the entire Detroit area economy was collapsing, anyway, it was in a long-term decline because of the the companies like General Motors and others who were rooted there, but they didn't see themselves as citizens, and therefore they went wherever the labor costs were lower and wherever they didn't have to deal with unions and all of that, right? But they left behind a community that was completely dependent on them, and it was bereft. I think it's pretty unconscionable when companies do that. They need to have that sense of rootedness about where they're from. But regardless, Detroit was on that slope, and then 2008 financial crisis came, and this city was bankrupt, and it was devastated. The business community came together under the leadership of DTA. Then they got all the major companies, quite a lot of big companies still in that. And the business community came together and identified what are the biggest challenges, the 10 or 12 biggest challenges. And each company took a lead in one of those, whether it had to do with public transportation or technical education or schooling or all kinds of things. And they took the lead and they mobilized resources around that. They worked with the mayor's office and others and universities, etc., and came up with a comprehensive set of initiatives, which within a few years has really turned that whole region around to the benefit of everybody. Every one of those companies is now doing better because the region is thriving again. Had they simply sat back and waited for the governor or the mayor to do something, they would have, some of them would have gone bankrupt or would have left Detroit. So I think there's a great opportunity and a responsibility to act like citizens, to come together, to cooperate, not try to do it alone, but don't wait for somebody else to take the lead.
So flourishing in an ocean of suffering, that certainly is a reality that sometimes we see and maybe so in so many Latin American countries, we have that inequality that you mentioned about. Talking about the younger entrepreneurs, millennials, which are already spread in the business community, and then centennials coming before that. What do you see in those generations, Raj? And is there hope in that, or is there more concern? And now maybe the pandemic has also brought up other concerns around the business community. What would you say about those generations and conscious capitalism?
Well, it's an interesting paradox, right? So the millennials especially are the most purpose-driven generation we've ever had. Most people in my generation, I'm a late baby boomer, we got to a sense of finding our purpose in life around midlife. We have the midlife crisis when you turn about 40. That there's a real thing. It shows in the developmental psychology literature that the midlife crisis is a crisis of meaning and purpose. Yeah. So for most of us, as I said, it came around midlife when you say, wow, I have less than half my life left, and is it just going to be more of the same? That I have achieved what I dreamt about when I was 20, if I have a big house and I have 2 cars and I have this much salary, I'll be the happiest person. And now I have all that and I feel empty, and what's the meaning of it? And is it just going to be more of the same? So people come to that. But if you look at the millennials, they've come to that in their teenage years. Why? Because they've grown up with a world that has many crises and lots of information and the web. So they're intensely aware of the state of the world, right? And so on the one hand, you have that idealism and the sense of purpose at an early age. On the other hand, they are the most skeptical and cynical about business compared to any other generation. Until then, maybe the succeeding generations might be even more cynical. And that's what the data shows. The majority of young people think that socialism is a better idea than capitalism today. Now, they've never actually experienced a socialist. I did in India as a democratic socialist. With the marginal tax rate was 97.5%, and there's red tape and bureaucracy and terrible quality and 1.2% economic growth rate. So we know that doesn't work. But the young people are so frustrated with what capitalism is doing and the fact that they think it's destroying their future and the planet and causing all of this this suffering, that they are completely against, many of them, business. Now, I experienced this a few years ago. I was teaching a summer camp for high school students, and we were exposing them to conscious capitalism. So these were 40 students that were selected from all over the US. Very accomplished young people, right? I mean, they all had various initiatives that they had started, and they were all passionate about solving some important challenges, whether it had to do with food or housing or water or energy, any of those kinds of things. And we had them read the book, and we offered a session on conscious capital, got them to think about business. And then at the end I asked them, how many of you intend to go into business? Not one.
Wow.
0 out of 40. I said, what do you plan to do? They all want to start a non-profit. Right? They want to start a non-profit. Why? Because non-profits are seen as virtuous and good, and businesses are seen as selfish and greedy. And you don't want, as an idealistic young person, to be associated with selfishness and greed, right? And I said to them, that problem that you want to solve as a non-profit, see if you can solve it as a business. Because that means that you've created a business model that is going to be self-sustaining, and it'll be far more scalable, right? Other than, instead of relying on donations and subsidies, right? And you have to break this wall that we have created between virtuous non-profits and selfish, greedy businesses. That's a false distinction. I know many non-profits that are toxic environments and are full with strife. And I know many businesses that are noble and ethical and heroic and beautiful, right? So virtue does not reside in one place or the other, but this is the story that we have told about capitalism. When for 50 years we've been celebrating greed is good, right? Selfishness is a virtue. Getting wealthy is the biggest value in society. Well, young people get alienated from that, right? And hence this flirtation. So this antipathy towards capitalism is a self-inflicted wound, because we have told a story about business that does not inspire anybody. In fact, it turns people off. And I think that's what we have to change. And I think that's what conscious capitalism, social capitalism, our movements are trying to say. You don't have to make this false choice to say that you either have pure free market, winner take all, dog eat dog, the jungle, rule of the jungle market over here, or you have this other system of socialism where you take whatever is there and divide it up equally, right? Mm-hmm. So capitalism promises dynamism, as Jonathan Haidt has talked about, and delivers on dynamism, right? Innovation, creative destruction, all the things we see around here, these are products of capitalism. So it promises and delivers dynamism. Socialism promises decency, but unfortunately cannot deliver. Why? Because there's no innovation and the pie remains fixed. And over time it actually shrinks. And then you're dividing that up, right? So it becomes the equal sharing of misery and more intense misery over time, right? And yet the fact is that as human beings, we crave decency. We have a heart, right? We are wired to care. We want people to have basic things, in their life, to be, safe and have a house and have education, etc., and healthcare. So we want decency and we need dynamism. In society, we cannot survive in this planet another 100 years. We're going to have to reinvent every aspect of our life in the next 100 years. We can't continue business as usual in any sector, right? And all that is innovation. It's going to come from capitalism. So we need that, but we also crave decency. And so what we're trying to do, I think, with our movements is we're saying that we want dynamism with decency. And when you do it this way, you actually get greater dynamism because people are engaged and passionate and creative and committed and loyal. And you get true decency. It's not about giving somebody a handout and taking away their dignity and their motivation in life, right? They are actually able to earn a good living and be proud of what they're doing and enjoy it and have a meaning and purpose in their life. So it's greater dynamism with true decency. And these are the trade-offs that we are forced to make, and we are polarized and we think it's black or white. No, it's actually the best of both. How do we get the best of both of these seeming opposite things in the world? And that's, I think, the power of our movements, is that it is offering us that potential of and not or.
Excellent. Thank you, Raj. Federico, regarding this concept of what could be philanthropy or this NGO involvement or support from the business community, what's the philosophy behind Capitalismo Social? Regarding what's your vision regarding those those maybe two opposite worlds of the NGOs and business, and what's the relationship? How's the philosophy?
Well, Raj put it very clear, and I totally agree with him. I don't think I can say it as eloquently as he did, but the way I see things is it's not about philanthropy. It shouldn't be about philanthropy. And one of the things that he said really, really well, it's you would destroy in a way their sense of purpose of whoever's receiving just a benefit of some sort. I think it goes much deeper into letting the nature of the human being, of being free, of innovating, of being productive, of having a purpose. And what's wrong about or what has gone wrong in this model we've been talking about is that these freedom of opportunities, this equality of opportunities are not there. And that is what is destroying this model that I think we all believe that it's the best model. But when in the truth you see these hard-working people, creative, smart, but the environment does not permit them to advance because there's a monopoly in whatever area they're going through, or there's crony capitalism in that area and he just gets bumps out. So what we need to create is just well, as you remember, we have four basic themes that we work in our initiative, and the first one is freedom of entrepreneurship, and obviously to have that you need to have laws that permit that. You need to avoid crony capitalism. You need to have a system where it's very simple for any innovative ideas to flourish. And that's not the way it works, and much less in Mexico than in the US or other parts of the world. And what happens is that you see very little social movement, and that is what people are mad about. So you look into the kind of companies that are the biggest companies in Mexico, and you know they're pretty much the same that they were 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, and obviously that shouldn't be the case. I mean, there's new ideas, there are people, smarter people, more hardworking people that should be there, but the system is not letting that happen. So we need to fix the system. We don't need to change the system. We need to fine-tune the system. And actually, I think it's fine-tuning, but this little fine-tuning has big change.
You know, there's an expression that entrepreneurs and terrorists are two sides of the same coin. So when you have places in the world like the Middle East where there's no future and there's no economic activity and there's no entrepreneurship, and there's 40-50% unemployment of young people, that's when young people then turn towards things like terrorism, right? Which is a form of social entrepreneurship if you think about it. Right? They're trying to bring about some kind of social change in that way. So I think creating the conditions where people actually have opportunities and they feel like there's fairness and equity in the system, right? And when that doesn't exist, that's when you start to see these kinds of extreme developments in society. So I think it's so critical that we fix these conditions that exist in our society so that people do have those opportunities. And I think you always have to say, we build a system where there's fairness and equity and opportunity and a merit-based approach. But at the same time, you also need to have some kind of a safety net too, right? Because it's another polarity. You know, when you have justice, you also need to have mercy. You can't just be all about justice and have no mercy at all, right? And if you only have mercy, then you will not have justice or fairness. So we want to focus on fairness But at the same time, there are people who are born without certain capacities or certain capabilities. So we still have to retain that compassionate floor, right? So that people who are not able to do it in that way can still have a dignified life.
You give me a head start to the next question that I had for both of you. We're talking a lot about the role of business and the business community, but I know that we're not necessarily libertarians here. What would be the role of civic society and government? Because I think that the two words that we have much mentioned is system and model. In this system or in this model, which would be your role, Raj, if you could start, of civic society and government in this system?
Well, I think all three are vital. I mean, society is a three-legged stool, right? It's government, it's business, and it's civil society. And so all three sectors have to operate in a way that contributes to the flourishing of the whole. So there has to be a vision for what is an ideal society. And there are philosophers like Rudolf Steiner, who talked about his philosophy of what makes an ideal society, and it has roles for all of them. So I think we have to have collaboration across that, because if you look at who is really the most impactful in terms of the system, it's really the government. The government has tremendous power in most systems. They have coercive power. Businesses only have voluntary exchange, right? Businesses can't force you to buy from them or to work for them or to supply or to invest, right? They can only offer you a value exchange, and if you think you're going to be better off, then you engage in that as a customer, as an employee, etc. And that's the magic of free markets, right? That's how everybody gets lifted up, because there's positive value created in each of those. Governments have coercive power. Governments can put you in jail or put you to death for something that you do, which, it may be perfectly acceptable over there, but it's not acceptable here. So there's great power that governments do have, which is why we have to be careful. Governments don't get too much power. But at the same time, with that power comes the ability to affect change. Now, China, we don't agree with a lot of things about China, but the fact is what they've been able to do in 20 years in terms of uplifting, probably 800 million people now. They've eradicated extreme poverty, and they've uplifted about 800 million into the middle class almost, right, and built tremendous interest. I mean, that's because they've got a government that has the ability to do things very quickly. So I think government has tremendous power, but we need the wisdom. With that power, we need the wisdom to be able to design a system that is actually then going to lead to the kind of dynamic actions by others to create the kind of society that we want. And unfortunately, that wisdom is missing. I find that systems thinking as a discipline is the most essential discipline, I think, in the world, and yet it's probably the least understood and practiced, right? And without that, you really cannot design a healthy company or a healthy society. You have to understand how everything is connected and interdependent, and where are the levers of change if you want to bring about a certain behavior in that system.
And what about civic society and its role?
Well, I would have to say that it's part of our mission in Centro. We believe that social society needs to step up many notches because as we were saying about this flaws that capitalism has, well, democracy does as well, and the only way to try to fix some of those difficulties with democracy, it's an empowered social society, and so we feel that we need to empower the social society, because again, with democracy we have these short-term views because that's the way it works, and the people that can give that long-term view and work sort of a counter power with government is social society. So we definitely believe that it plays a big role, and we are hoping we can sponsor a much stronger civil society.
So maybe in closing comments, and thank you, this has been an enriching conversation. We can go on for 2 more hours, but talking about community in Monterrey, talking about Tech de Monterrey community, which would be your final thoughts around these ideas of conscious capitalism and the tipping point that we may be as a society? I don't know, Federico, if you want to start.
Well, I'll be relatively quick. One, and I said it earlier, is that I don't think it's optional. I think we need to move into this direction. How fast we can do it and how deep we can do it, it'll depend on the engagement of the business society particularly. Obviously, if we have the help of government, much better. But we always take the risk that they go way to one side or the other. And probably going into something that I thought you were asking earlier, was that this is not for the big companies. This is for everybody. You don't need to think that in order to be profitable or to be able to take these practices, you need to be a big company. It's simple human decency or responsibility. It's how do you treat others. It's don't pay a wage that it's not enough. And if paying a decent job it won't work, then don't do it. That is not a business that you should be doing. And once you do that, once people get, for example, in Mexico, that wages are so low, at the moment that people understand that having better wages, it'll be something that it's just the economy moving. We will have more commercial activity, and your business will be doing better, and they will be in a better position, and it's just a circle that enlightens everybody. So I think when we think about this, you don't even have to go very deep into our books, into our theories. I always say, if you want to put it in one simple way, it's just think long term. What is it? And think long term and think holistically. What happens with your environment, with your community, with your client, with your supplier. It's as long as you have that holistic view, that's basically what we're talking about. Because we went into this short-term view of how do I make more profit today. Yeah. And that would probably be my closing.
Thank you, Federico.
Well, that's beautifully said. Very inspiring. The last thought that I would like to leave, especially young people, with, I recently wrote an essay for a book called "The Business of Business is the Future." Because I've, in my life, never experienced a time when the future seemed like such a scary place as it is today. There are so many people that worry today of what's going to happen in the future, right? We used to always think of the future as just this horizon of incredible things and amazing technologies and all these new innovations and ways of improving our life. And now we think, oh my God, how are we going to live and what's going to happen, right? So I want people to think about the future with some optimism and to recognize that we have the ability to shape that future. It's not an inevitable thing that we're looking at, and that all the things that we fear about how the future could unfold are all actually tremendous multi-trillion-dollar business opportunities in a way, to make those transitions from the old way that is destroying so much in the world to actually coming up with the new ways that are going to put us on a different path. Those are all business opportunities. And so I think that is the expression is that the future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed. The answers and the solutions are already with us. We know what we need to do about food and about energy, right, and about everything. The solutions are already out there, or we have people who have the innovations that they are, it's in their capacity to come up with those. So I think thinking about the future, being optimistic and hopeful, and recognizing that all the threats are actually opportunities.
Opportunities that could become conscious businesses.
Oh yeah, only if you approach it in a conscious way. Right? I think I'd like to close actually with a quote from Lynn Twist. who has been here. I think she's the founder of, he wrote a book called The Soul of Money and started the Pachamama Alliance. But she said those of us who are alive today have the opportunity to lead the most meaningful lives that human beings have ever led. Because our challenges are greater than ever, but so is our capacity and our ability to do something about them. So we can find more meaning and more positive impact in the world today than at any other time. So I think that's really the hopeful message that I hope you take away from this.
Well, Raj, Federico, thank you very much, and thank you all for having us in this special place of Don Eugenio's house.